High in the jagged spine of Japan's northern mountains, there is a place where the clouds don't just carry rain, they carry the weight of a dying empire. Below these peaks, tucked away in valleys that the modern world has long since scrubbed from its maps, lies a sprawling skeleton of rusted steel and crumbling concrete. It is a kingdom built on poison, a place where the ground itself was sacrificed for the birth of a nation. Today, the wind whistles through empty elevator shafts and over hillsides where nothing has grown for a century. We are told stories of Japan's neon lights and high-speed rails, but nobody talks about the toxic heart that once pumped the lifeblood into that very same progress. This is the story of a ghost that refuses to rest, a silent empire of copper and chemicals that was once the richest place in the East, and is now a scar on the earth that may never heal. To understand how a mountain can become a tomb, you have to look back to a time when the air was thick with the smell of sulfur and the sound of progress was a deafening roar. In the late 19th century, Japan was a nation in a desperate hurry. It was shedding its feudal skin and reaching for the industrial might of the West. At the center of this transformation was copper. It was the metal of the future, needed for wiring, for telegraphs, for the very electricity that would light up Tokyo. And nowhere was copper more abundant than here, in these remote, unforgiving highlands. What started as a few scattered pits soon metastasized into a sprawling industrial monster. By the early 1900s, this wasn't just a mine. It was a sovereign state. Thousands of miles of tunnels were carved deep into the rock, a subterranean labyrinth that mirrored the growing cities on the surface. At its peak, the Ashio region produced a staggering portion of Japan's total output. It was the engine of an empire, and for the people who lived in its shadow, it felt like the center of the universe. Walking through the skeletal remains today, it is hard to imagine that these silent valleys once pulsed with the energy of over 100,000 people. Imagine a city where there should only be forest. In the 1920s and 30s, these mining towns were the height of modernity. While much of rural Japan was still lit by oil lamps, the mining empire had electricity. There were grand wooden theaters, where the latest silent films played to packed houses of miners and their families. There were bustling markets filled with goods brought in by the dedicated railway lines that snaked through the gorges. Schools were built on the hillsides, their corridors ringing with the laughter of thousands of children. To live here was to be at the cutting edge. The company provided everything: housing, hospitals, even the very water the people drank. It was a paternalistic paradise, a world where the company was father, mother, and God. But even then, in the golden age of the empire, the rot was beginning to set in. If you looked closely, you could see it in the stunted trees. If you listened, you could hear it in the coughs of the men emerging from the shafts. The price of the copper was being paid in more than just sweat. Huge smelting plants were constructed to process the ore, and their chimneys belched a constant, thick yellow smoke into the valley. This was sulfur dioxide, a gas that turns into sulfuric acid when it meets moisture. The forests that had once covered these mountains began to dissolve. First, the needles fell from the pines. Then, the bark peeled away like burnt skin. By the 1940s, the mountains were stripped bare, reduced to jagged mounds of gray rock and dead stumps. Without trees to hold the soil, the rains brought landslides, washing toxic silt down into the rivers. The water turned a sickly, iridescent blue-green, and the fish simply disappeared. Despite the environmental devastation, the town continued to swell. Following the end of the Second World War, as Japan began its miraculous economic recovery, the demand for copper reached a fever pitch. The 1950s were the empire's final frantic hurrah. The streets were neon-lit and crowded. New concrete apartment blocks were erected to house the influx of workers, replacing the old wooden shacks. There were dance halls and modern department stores. W 1955 The local hospital was one of the most advanced in the prefecture, a necessity for treating the constant stream of industry. For a brief moment, it seemed like the prosperity would never end. The people ignored the fact that the river below them was a ribbon of lead and arsenic. They ignored the fact that their children were playing in dirt that could never grow a flower. They were part of something bigger. They were building the new Japan. But the turn of the decade brought the first whispers of the end. By the early 1960s, the easy copper was gone. The tunnels had to go deeper, the costs were rising, and cheaper ore was beginning to flood in from overseas. Slowly, the gears of the empire began to grind and skip. The first sign of the coming silence wasn't a sudden collapse, but a gradual thinning of the blood. In 1962, the primary railway line saw its passenger services slashed as people began to find work elsewhere. Small businesses that had served the miners for generations, the tailors, the watchmakers, the noodle shops, began to board up their windows. The decline was quiet at first, a slow leak of energy. The real turning point came in 1973. It was the year the heart of the empire finally stopped beating. The main smelting plant, the giant that had breathed fire and poison for nearly a century, was shuttered. It was a blow from which the region would never recover. Almost overnight, the reason for the town's existence vanished. The company, which had once promised to look after its workers from cradle to grave, began a massive downsizing. The exodus was swift and brutal. Families who had lived in the valley for 3 generations packed what they could carry into small trucks and drove away, leaving behind the heavy furniture, the school books, and the memories. By the mid-1970s, the grand theaters were dark. The projectors that had once flickered with the dreams of thousands were left to rust in the damp mountain air. By 1977, the final elementary school in the Upper Valley held its last graduation ceremony. There were only 4 students left. The sound of the school bell, which had once signaled the start of the day for thousands, echoed through a valley that was already half reclaimed by the silence. The following year, the post office closed its doors, and the town lost its official heartbeat. Public transport routes were canceled, leaving the few remaining elderly residents stranded in a landscape that was increasingly hostile. The grocery stores followed, their shelves left half empty as the distributors refused to make the long trip up the winding mountain roads for a handful of customers. What was once a thriving urban center was being dismantled by neglect, one shuttered door at a time. As the 1980s arrived, the empire had become a graveyard. The concrete apartment blocks, once symbols of modern progress, were now hollow shells. Windows were shattered by the winter storms, and the relentless mountain vines began to claw their way up the walls, seeking a foothold in the crumbling mortar. But while the people were gone, the poison remained. The toxic part of the empire wasn't just a metaphor. The ground beneath the abandoned towns was a cocktail of heavy metals. For decades, the runoff from the mine tailings had seeped into the water table. The mountainsides, stripped of their vegetation, continued to bleed orange and red into the streams. The authorities tried to contain it, building massive check dams and attempting to replant the hills, but the land resisted. The soil was so saturated with copper and zinc that the new saplings simply withered and died within weeks of being planted. It was a landscape that had been fundamentally altered, a place where the natural cycle of life had been broken by the hand of industry. As the 1990s dawned, a strange stillness settled over the valley. In the rest of Japan, the bubble economy had reached a fever pitch. Neon lights screamed in Tokyo, and money flowed like water. But here, the only thing flowing was the sludge. The 1990s were the years when the empire truly became a ghost. It was during this decade that the last of the company men, the engineers and maintenance crews who had been kept on to monitor the decaying infrastructure, were finally given their walking papers. In 1992, the power was cut to the upper reaches of the mountain for the last time. The hum of the transformers, A sound that had been the heartbeat of the valley for a century simply ceased. When the lights went out, they stayed out. Walking through the ruins now, you can find the remnants of lives interrupted. In a small apartment building on the edge of the ravine, there is a room where a calendar still hangs on the wall, frozen in August 1994. A pair of children's shoes sits by the door, covered in a thick layer of gray dust. In the kitchen, a tea set remains on the table, the cups stained brown by evaporated water. Why did they leave so fast? Some say it was the realization that the health of their children was being traded for a history that no longer mattered. Others say it was simply the crushing weight of the silence. When the last grocery store in the lower district closed in 1996, the final thread of community was snapped. To live here was no longer a choice, it was a sentence. But what happened next is what truly haunts the few who still remember. As the people vanished, the toxicity didn't just stay in the ground, it began to migrate. The massive slag heaps, millions of tons of crushed rock and chemical waste began to shift. Without the constant maintenance of the mining company, the containment systems started to fail. In the late 90s, after a particularly heavy typhoon season, reports began to surface of strange, multicolored seeps appearing in the basements of abandoned homes miles away from the mine site. The water wasn't just polluted, it was caustic. It was as if the mountain itself was trying to purge the poison we had injected into it, sending it back down to the world of the living. Yet, despite the danger, a few souls remained. They were the stayers, mostly elderly residents who had spent their entire lives in the service of the Copper King. For them, the toxicity was an old friend. They had breathed it, bathed in it, and buried their friends in it. By 2002, the local clinic, which had once seen hundreds of patients a day, was reduced to a single room staffed by a part-time nurse who visited once a week. The waiting room, once filled with the coughs of miners, was now empty. The plastic chairs cracked and peeling in the sun. It was in 2004 that the last official medical service in the Upper Valley was discontinued. If you got sick after that, you were on your own. There is a mystery that clings to the deeper levels of the mines, a secret buried beneath millions of tons of flooded rock. In the early 2000s, urban explorers and former workers began to speak of the blue chambers. They claimed that in the deepest shafts, where the groundwater had reclaimed the tunnels, the water had turned a blue so intense it looked like liquid neon. This wasn't the blue of a tropical ocean. It was the blue of concentrated copper sulfate, a beautiful, deadly invitation. Some believe that there are still massive pockets of unrefined ore down there, reacting with the rising water to create a subterranean lake of acid. Nobody knows for sure, because the government sealed the main entrances with massive concrete plugs in 2007. They didn't just want to keep people out, they wanted to lock the secret in. The decline of the mining empire wasn't just an economic failure, it was a cultural erasure. By 2010, the region had become a marginal village, or Genkai Shuraku, a place where more than half the population is over the age of 65. The younger generation had long since fled to the cities, driven away by the lack of jobs and the stigma of the poisoned valley. In the mid-2010s, even the memory of the place began to fade from the national consciousness. The textbooks might mention the Ashio copper mine incident as a footnote in the history of labor rights or environmental law, but they don't talk about the reality of the ruins today. They don't talk about the way the rust eats through the iron gates of the elementary school, or how the mountain air still smells faintly of matches on a humid day. But why the silence? Why does nobody talk about this place? To acknowledge the toxic empire is to acknowledge the dark side of Japan's miracle. Every skyscraper in Shinjuku, every bullet train that streaks across the countryside, and every high-tech factory in Nagoya owes a debt to these mountains. The copper pulled from these depths built the modern nation, but the cost of that progress was the total sacrifice of a landscape and its people. It is a story of discarded people and discarded land. To look at the ruins is to see the skeletons in the closet of a superpower. In 2011, the Great East Japan earthquake sent tremors through the entire country, and even here, in the remote mountains, the ghosts were stirred. Several of the old mining dams, which held back millions of tons of toxic sludge, were found to be at risk of collapsing. The fear of a toxic tsunami briefly flickered in the local news, but it was quickly overshadowed by the nuclear disaster in Fukushima. Once again, the mining empire was pushed into the shadows. The government scrambled to reinforce the dams, burying more of the history under fresh layers of concrete. They built walls to hide the scars, but you can't hide the truth from the river. Today, if you drive up the narrow, winding roads that lead to the heart of the old empire, you are greeted by signs that warn you not to enter the forests. They say the ground is unstable, but the locals know better. The ground is hungry. In 2015, the last small convenience store in the lower foothills closed its doors, leaving the valley without a single place to buy food. To get supplies, the few remaining residents, now numbering less than a few hundred across dozens of square miles, must wait for a mobile grocery truck that winds its way up the mountain twice a month. It is a fragile existence, a slow-motion vanishing act. The most eerie part of the empire isn't the collapsed tunnels or the rusted machinery. It's the way nature has begun to return, but in a twisted, distorted form. The trees that grow near the old smelter sites are small, their branches gnarled and blackened. The moss that carpets the concrete ruins is a strange, vivid shade of orange, thriving on the minerals that would kill any other plant. It's as if a new ecosystem is being born from the wreckage, one that doesn't need us and doesn't want us. In the silence of the 2020s, the empire has become a laboratory of the end times, a glimpse into a world where humanity's impact remains long after we are gone. As you stand on the precipice of the main open-pit mine, looking down into the gray void, you realize that this wasn't just a workplace. It was a promise that failed. The promise was that industry would bring eternal prosperity, that the mountain would always provide, and that the company would always protect. But the mountain is exhausted, the company is a ghost, and the prosperity has moved elsewhere. What remains is a monumental lesson in the permanence of our mistakes. We are told that time heals all wounds, but as you look out over the chemical-streaked hills of the empire, you start to wonder if some wounds are simply too deep for time to reach. The toxic empire isn't just a place in the mountains. It's a specter that haunts the very idea of progress, a reminder that everything we build is anchored in something we have destroyed. By 2021, the transformation was almost complete. The silence that once felt like a temporary lull had become a permanent resident. In the lower valleys, where a few stubborn houses still cling to the roadsides, the rhythm of life is dictated by the passage of time rather than the punch of a clock. The children who once filled the mountain schools are now grandparents, living in high-rises in Saitama or Chiba. Their only connection to this place a fading photograph or a name on a neglected family grave. In 2022, the last local bus line, a service that had been reduced to a single van once a day, was finally discontinued. The authorities cited lack of demand, a polite way of saying that the town had finally run out of people to move. When that van made its final journey down the mountain, it took with it the last thread of the empire's connection to the outside world. But why does this place feel different from the thousands of other shrinking towns across Japan? The answer lies in the soil. In most abandoned places, nature eventually heals the wounds left by man. Vines cover the walls, trees break through the asphalt, and the air turns sweet again. But here, the healing is stalled. The toxicity of the mining empire has created a dead zone that refuses to follow the rules of the natural world. In 2023, independent researchers testing the sediment in the lower riverbeds found levels of arsenic and lead that still far exceed safety standards remnants of spills and runoff that occurred half a century ago. This isn't a ghost town that is being reclaimed by the forest. It is a ghost town that is being preserved in a chemical amber. The poison has become a preservative, keeping the ruins from decaying into soil, leaving them to stand as jagged monuments to a lost age. Few people expected what would happen in the years that followed the official abandonment. As the human footprint vanished, the mountain began to behave in ways that defy explanation. There are reports from the few remaining foresters of white forests, patches of timber where the trees have died but refused to rot, bleached bone white by the acidic groundwater. There is a sense that the landscape itself is in a state of trauma. In 2024, a survey of the old smelting site revealed that the concrete foundations are vibrating. It's not an earthquake, but a tectonic groan, the weight of the mountain shifting as the thousands of miles of empty tunnels beneath it slowly begin to collapse under the pressure of the rising water. The empire is sinking into itself, a slow-motion implosion that no one is around to witness. This is the great irony of Japan's toxic empire. The very minerals that made the nation wealthy have now made the land uninhabitable. We talk about the economic miracle, the rise of the tech giants, and the sleek efficiency of modern Japanese life. But we rarely look at the cost of the foundation. This valley is the receipt for that miracle. It represents a period in history when progress was seen as a god that required a sacrifice. The people who lived here, who worked the mines and breathed the yellow smoke, were told they were heroes of the state. But when the copper ran out and the poison became too much to ignore, the state simply moved on, leaving the heroes to fade away in a landscape that can no longer sustain them. The mystery of the blue chambers remains the ultimate symbol of this hidden history. In the summer of 2024, a team, using remote drones, attempted to map the flooded lower levels of the mine. What they found was a world of terrifying beauty. The drones captured images of massive subterranean halls, larger than cathedrals, where the water is a deep, glowing turquoise. The walls are encrusted with crystals of blue vitriol, sparkling like jewels in the drone's headlights. It is a palace of poison, a beautiful, deadly kingdom that will never be seen by human eyes again. It serves as a reminder that the empire hasn't truly disappeared. It has simply moved underground, out of sight and out of mind, where it will continue to react and change for centuries to come. As we look at the ruins of the grand theaters and the empty apartment blocks, we are seeing more than just a failed industry. We are seeing a preview of a possible future. Japan is currently facing a vanishing crisis, with thousands of rural communities on the brink of extinction as the population ages and shrinks. But the toxic empire is the extreme version of this trend. It is what happens when a place is used until it is broken and then discarded. It is a cautionary tale about the permanence of our industrial legacy. We can build a city in a decade, but we cannot unpoison a mountain in a century. The emotional weight of this place is most felt in the small things. It's the rusted swings in a playground where no one has sat for 40 years. It's the row of lockers in the mine's changing room, some still holding the work clothes of men who walked out in 1973 and never looked back. It's the silence of the valley, a silence so thick it feels like a physical weight on your chest. There is a profound sadness in the realization that a place that once buzzed with the hopes and dreams of over 100,000 people can be so thoroughly erased from the conversation. But perhaps the silence is intentional. To talk about the toxic empire is to admit that our path to the future has left behind a trail of destruction that we don't know how to fix. It is easier to look at the neon of Tokyo than the gray rock of the mountains. It is easier to celebrate the new than to mourn the sacrificed. But the mountains don't forget. The orange rivers and the white trees and the blue water and the deep dark are all keeping a record. They are a testament to an era of unbridled ambition and the heavy price that nature eventually extracts. As the sun sets over the jagged peaks, casting long, distorted shadows across the ruins. The toxic empire feels less like a graveyard and more like a sleeping giant. It is a place that has been pushed to the very edge of existence, standing on the threshold between history and nothingness. The wind continues to howl through the broken windows of the company headquarters, a lonely sound that seems to ask, was it worth it? There is no one left to answer. Only the mountain remains, scarred and silent, carrying its burden of copper and chemicals into an uncertain future. The story of Japan's toxic abandoned empire is not just about a mine or a town. It is about the relationship between what we build and what we destroy. It is a reminder that every light in the city has a shadow in the mountains. And as the last few elders of the valley eventually pass away, taking the final living memories of the empire with them, the land will continue its slow, toxic transformation. It will remain a forbidden kingdom, a place of haunting beauty and invisible danger, a silent witness to the cost of an empire. We may choose not to talk about it, but the empire will always be there, waiting in the clouds, breathing through the earth, a ghost that refuses to be forgotten.